100 times more powerful? That is the claim attached to the Trump-class battleship. 100 times more powerful than any battleship ever built. And before you dismiss that as political theater, consider what is actually being described. A warship that carries hypersonic missiles with intercontinental reach. A warship with laser weapons that cannot run out of ammunition. A warship with an electromagnetic railgun that fires projectiles at speeds that make a response window measured in seconds feel generous. A warship with 128 missile cells, more than any surface combatant America has ever put to sea. A warship displacing 30,000 tons, longer than the largest battleship in history, capable of speeds above 30 knots, and designed to command an entire fleet from its own integrated combat center. 100 times more powerful? The number sounds like a campaign slogan. The hardware makes it sound like an understatement. The United States Navy is building 3 of them. Construction on the first, the USS Defiant, begins in 2028. The price for that first ship is $17 billion, breaking every previous record for the cost of a warship. And behind that price tag, behind the specifications, behind the doctrine that brought this ship into existence, is a story about how naval warfare itself has changed, and how America's adversaries miscalculated the response that change would trigger. In this video, we are going to look at exactly why the weapons that China and Russia spent 30 years building to defeat American carriers have now accelerated the creation of a platform those weapons were never designed to stop, what the BBG-X actually is beneath the superlatives, every system, every capability, every technical challenge that stands between its conception and the moment it sails, why the battleship died 80 years ago, and why the logic that killed it has now paradoxically justified its return, and what 3 Trump-class battleships mean for the global naval balance that adversaries spent decades engineering to America's disadvantage. But first, let's look at the problem the BBG-X was built to solve, because the threat that created it is already deployed, already aimed, and already changing how every navy on Earth thinks about the next war at sea. The problem is not one thing. It is 3 things arriving simultaneously, each one individually stressing American naval doctrine, together creating a gap that the existing fleet cannot close. The first is the cost exchange crisis. American naval power projection is built on expensive ships firing expensive missiles to intercept adversary weapons that cost a fraction of the interceptors used to stop them. A Houthi drone launched from Yemen costs a few $1,000s. The missiles used to shoot it down cost hundreds of thousands each. Russia sells Shahed-type drones for pocket change compared to the interceptors they force Ukraine, and now American naval vessels, to expend against them. China is building drone arsenals at a production pace and unit cost that makes sustained attrition of American interceptor magazines not just possible, but mathematically inevitable in a prolonged engagement. The arithmetic is brutal. A carrier strike group carries a finite magazine. An adversary willing to accept drone losses in exchange for missile exhaustion does not need to sink a ship. It needs to empty the magazine. Once the interceptors are gone, the next wave comes through. And the wave after that, and the wave after that. American naval power projection, for the first time in decades, faces a threat that does not need to win a direct engagement to win. The second is the hypersonic problem. China's ballistic anti-ship missiles and Russia's hypersonic anti-ship weapons travel at speeds above Mach 5 on maneuvering trajectories. The intercept window against a hypersonic weapon is measured in seconds. Existing naval defense systems were engineered around the physics of slower threats. The time available to detect, classify, track, compute an intercept solution, fire, and confirm a kill is sufficient against a subsonic or even a supersonic missile. Against a hypersonic weapon maneuvering through its terminal phase, that window collapses. The same radar that worked perfectly against the last generation of threats is now racing a clock it cannot consistently beat. The third is the carrier concentration problem. The carrier is the center of gravity of American power projection. China has built an entire operational doctrine, anti-access and area denial, around that single fact. Find the carrier. The carrier must be close enough to the target to launch its air wing effectively. That operational requirement constrains where it can be. Satellites track it. Maritime patrol aircraft track it. Ballistic anti-ship missiles are pre-positioned for the zone where the carrier must operate. The carrier's greatest strength, the range and mass of its air wing, is also the constraint that makes it locatable. China has spent 30 years and an enormous fraction of its defense budget on this one targeting problem. 3 problems: cost exchange, hypersonic intercept, carrier targeting, each one independently serious. Together, they represent the first genuine challenge to American naval supremacy since the Cold War. So why does this matter right now? Because the United States Navy has decided that the answer to all 3 problems is the same ship. Until now, the BBG-X is the answer. And to understand why it answers all 3 problems simultaneously, you have to understand what it is designed to carry and how those systems map onto each specific threat. Start with the directed energy weapons, because they are the most revolutionary systems aboard, and they address the cost exchange crisis at its root. The laser weapon system planned for the BBG-X operates in the 300 to 600 kilowatt range, with upgrade potential approaching 1 megawatt. At those power levels, the laser can destroy drone airframes, detonate incoming missiles, dazzle and disable sensors on enemy platforms, and engage multiple targets in rapid succession. None of that is new in concept. Laser defense systems have been tested and deployed on smaller American vessels for years. What is new is the scale of power generation the BBG-X provides. Smaller ships cannot generate the sustained electrical output needed to run a high-power laser through a sustained engagement. They can fire the laser. They cannot necessarily fire it continuously at full power through a 200-drone swarm for as long as the engagement lasts. The BBG-X can. Its vast hull contains a power generation architecture, diesel generators combined with gas turbines, managed by a sophisticated integrated power system with high-capacity energy storage, designed specifically to sustain the enormous electrical demand of directed energy weapons during combat. And here is what that means for the cost exchange crisis. A laser weapon does not have a magazine. It does not fire missiles. It fires electricity, converted into coherent light, generated continuously by the ship's own power plant. The per-engagement cost of a laser intercept is not hundreds of thousands of dollars. It is the fuel burned to generate the electricity for a fraction of a second of beam time. Against a 200-drone swarm, a laser does not exhaust. It burns, drone by drone, until the swarm is gone. The economics of attrition warfare that China and Russia have built their drone strategies around simply do not apply to a ship with a megawatt-class laser and the power plant to run it. The microwave-directed energy weapons operate at a different level of the same problem. Rather than destroying drones one by one, microwave weapons broadcast disruption across an area. They scramble the guidance electronics, sever the swarm communication links, and cause the formation to lose the coordinated behavior that makes it dangerous. The swarm does not get engaged individually. It falls apart as a system. The disruption is faster than any kinetic response, requires no per-shot munitions, and covers a wider engagement envelope than a single laser beam can address in a given moment. 2 directed energy systems, 2 different approaches to the same threat. Together they form a layered drone defense that does not care how many drones the adversary launches, because neither system has a magazine to exhaust. Now let's talk about the hypersonic problem. The BBG-X carries the AN/SPY-6 radar, the most capable integrated air and missile detection system the United States has ever deployed afloat. Against a hypersonic weapon, the intercept window is measured in seconds. Every second that the detection-to-intercept chain takes is a second that is not available for the weapons to do their job. The SPY-6 compresses that chain. It sees threats earlier, at longer range, with higher fidelity, and hands-off targeting solutions faster than any predecessor system. It does not solve the hypersonic intercept problem by itself, but it is the essential foundation for every system that does. Without a sensor layer that beats the adversary's weapon to the decision point, the fastest interceptor in the world is reacting too late. Against hypersonic threats that penetrate the outer defense layer, the BBG-X fields its conventional close-in systems, the rolling airframe missile launchers, the 5-inch naval guns, the 30mm rapid-fire systems, as a final defensive layer. These are not new technologies. They are proven systems, reliable under combat conditions, positioned as the last line of defense after the directed energy weapons and longer-range interceptors have addressed the inbound threat at every earlier stage of its approach. And then there is the railgun, because the railgun does something that no other defensive system on the ship does. The electromagnetic railgun fires a projectile at hypersonic velocity using electromagnetic acceleration. No propellant, no explosive warhead. Pure kinetic energy, generated by the ship's power plant and released in a fraction of a second. At ranges of 100 to 200 nautical miles on offense, the railgun projectile strikes a land target, an enemy ship, or a hardened installation with the kinetic force of a conventional explosive, traveling so fast that the target has almost no warning and essentially no response time. At shorter ranges on defense, the same physics apply to incoming threats. A hypersonic anti-ship missile traveling at Mach 5 toward the BBG-X meets a railgun projectile also traveling at hypersonic velocity in the opposite direction. The intercept window that makes hypersonic defense so difficult shrinks, but it shrinks for both sides. And the BBG-X is the one firing the railgun. Think about what that means. The weapon that makes hypersonic threats so dangerous, extreme speed, minimal response time, is also the characteristic that makes the railgun an effective counter. You fight speed with speed, and the BBG-X has a weapon that generates that speed from its own power plant, with an ammunition cost measured in electricity rather than dollars per missile. Now let's address the carrier targeting problem, because this is where the BBG-X's doctrinal implications are most profound. China's anti-access strategy assumes the carrier must be within a defined zone to be effective. Position enough anti-ship weapons to cover that zone and you have effectively denied it. The carrier cannot operate where it needs to operate without entering the kill box. This is the logic that has driven Chinese naval investment for 3 decades. It is a sound logic. Against a carrier-centric fleet, it works. The BBG-X's primary strike systems make that logic irrelevant. 12 conventional prompt strike hypersonic missiles, each one capable of striking any target on Earth within approximately 60 minutes of launch. The BBG-X does not need to be inside the zone China has optimized its defenses to cover. It can sit far outside that zone, beyond the range of the carrier-killer missiles, beyond the reach of the anti-access bubble, and still strike targets inside it. The targeting constraint that makes the carrier locatable does not apply to a ship whose primary weapon reaches intercontinental distances in an hour. The BBG-X does not need to be close to the target. It needs to be pointed at it. 128 vertical launch cells alongside those 12 hypersonic missiles. 25% more cells than the Arleigh Burke destroyer, currently America's primary surface combatant. Tomahawk cruise missiles, Standard missile interceptors, anti-submarine rockets, all loaded simultaneously, all ready to fire in parallel across multiple mission domains. A single ship that can strike a land target, intercept an inbound ballistic missile, and prosecute a submarine contact at the same time, without choosing which mission to prioritize, without the coordination overhead of distributing those tasks across multiple hulls. And the sea-launched cruise missile, nuclear. A nuclear-armed cruise missile, launched from a surface ship, reintroducing American surface fleet nuclear deterrence for the first time since the Cold War. For 30 years, adversaries calculated the nuclear balance in regional conflicts around the assumption that American surface ships were conventional-only platforms. That assumption is now false. Every scenario involving American surface forces must now account for a nuclear deterrence option that did not exist before the BBG-X. The ship carries a flight deck and dual hangars for V-22 Osprey aircraft and future vertical lift systems. It fields between 650 and 800 crew. It achieves speeds above 30 knots on a combined diesel and gas turbine propulsion system. And its design was developed not by scaling up an existing hull, the path that failed when the DDG-X destroyer program collapsed because the hull was too small for the systems it needed to carry, but by starting with the required systems and building the hull large enough to contain them. That design philosophy matters. The DDG-X's failure is instructive. The Navy tried to put next-generation weapons into a destroyer-sized hull and discovered that the power generation, the vertical launch cell count, the cooling systems, and the physical volume required for hypersonic missile integration all exceeded what a destroyer hull could provide. The program was abandoned. The BBG-X emerged from that failure with a different premise. The mission drives the size, not the other way around. The engineering challenges that remain are real. Power generation sufficient to sustain megawatt-class directed energy weapons in a maritime combat environment is not a solved problem. The digital engineering workflow, AI-assisted design, precision modular construction, high design maturity before the first weld, is an explicit attempt to avoid the construction delays that have plagued programs like the Constellation-class frigate, where the design was still being finalized years after work had begun on the lead ship. American shipyards are operating with workforce shortages and existing backlogs. $17 billion is an extraordinary price for a single hull, and the history of first-in-class warships with new technology across every system is not a history of first-time success. But the adversary miscalculation that drove this program into existence is worth stating precisely because it is the most important thing about the BBG-X and the least discussed. China spent 30 years designing weapons to defeat the carrier. Russia spent 30 years doing the same. Both assumed that American naval doctrine was fixed, that the carrier was the apex of American power at sea, that defeating the carrier meant defeating American power projection, and that everything needed to answer this challenge was therefore a carrier killer of one kind or another. They built hypersonic missiles to defeat carrier defense systems. They built drone arsenals to exhaust carrier strike group magazines. They built area denial bubbles to prevent carriers from operating where they need to be. They built all of this for a specific version of the American Navy. An American Navy that fights from carriers and nothing else. The BBG-X is not a carrier. It does not operate on the same constraints. It does not need to be close to the target to strike it. It does not run dry against a drone swarm. It does not have a single intercept gap that hypersonic missiles can exploit. It commands an entire surface action group from a single hardened platform. It integrates into a carrier strike group, filling the air defense command role that retired Ticonderoga cruisers once played. And it operates autonomously to secure sea lanes where a carrier's capabilities are unnecessary and its operational costs are unjustifiable. The Yamato taught the world that concentrating power in a single hull without matching defensive depth against the era's dominant threat creates a target, not a weapon. Every adversary who spent 3 decades building carrier killers applied that lesson correctly to the American carrier. They failed to ask what would happen if America applied the same lesson to itself and built a ship that concentrates power alongside defensive systems specifically engineered for the threats that exist right now. 3 Trump-class battleships, laser weapons that do not run dry, railguns that fight speed with speed, hypersonic strike that escapes the kill box entirely, nuclear deterrence returned to the surface fleet, and a hull large enough to contain all of it, built for a world that China and Russia plan to control and will now have to recalculate from scratch. 100 times more powerful? Against the threats that exist today, that number is starting to look like it might not be an exaggeration after all. If you found value in this, subscribe so you do not miss what comes next.